And now we're back to our special 10-year look back. And special guests, your past presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and James Carter. We are here to ask you some important questions of your personal experiences throughout this decade. But first, Nixon, can you explain the common political issues during your election as well as the details of your election? Well, during this time, I ran against Hubert Humphrey. He was a good man, politician, vice president under Lyndon B. Johnson. It was really a close election, but I'm glad America chose me at the time. Come to think of it, it was actually a third party that made the election possible, but that's another story. During this time, many of my political ads focused on the silent majority. I think it was because of my platform. It reached out to middle class and working citizens. And during this time, it was them that they wanted to help. And it was them who needed their voices to come out. I was hoping to bring peace after the many years of protests, both on war and equality. I know many citizens were against the war at the time, and many were still fighting for equal rights. A lot was happening inside and outside the country. You couldn't imagine how hard it was to find a balance between the two. However, many political issues dealt with a continuation from the 60s. There were anti-war issues, environmental movements, and equal rights for both women and minorities. Thank you, Nixon. And for Gerald Ford, we were wondering if you could tell America how you feel about being America's first unelected president.
Well, becoming president and recovering from the Watergate scandal was quite hard. At that time, I wanted to focus on improving the economy, and to do this, I wanted the government to be more involved. I vetoed many non-military policies because I thought that would make matters worse for the economy. My main goal was to fix the elevated inflation rates.
Oh, can you tell us about the win buttons?
So, the win buttons, these were buttons that I hoped my citizens would voluntarily help the rising inflation in our country. Whip inflation now is what it said, and that's what I thought. Although the buttons didn't really help as much as I hoped, it did spread awareness in citizens to contribute to society.
Thank you. And lastly, President Jimmy Carter. America would like to know the kind of tactics you used to win the election against Ford.
The election was very close, but I was able to use Ford's situation to my advantage. For instance, since Ford was an unelected president, I used Nixon's past failures to prove that I was the better candidate as the President of the United States of America. I developed my relationship with the people of the country during interviews all over the states. I talked about solving stagflation, and my slogan was, "A leader for change." Most of my ads depicted me as a man that was down to earth and shows my traditional roots as an American citizen that just wants to do the best for America.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Julia, and welcome back to AAJSM's 10-year look back on the 1970s. Now we will be looking back into the military conflicts of the 1970s. The Vietnam War was the main military conflict in the 1970s. Now, the origins of the war can be traced back to World War II, when the United States helped the Viet Minh expel the Japanese from Vietnam and declare themselves independent. France reasserted colonial control over its Southeast Asian territories after World War II, which in turn resulted in the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh resumed their guerrilla warfare against France with the goal of creating an independent Vietnam unified under a communist government. The Viet Minh gained significant advances in driving out the French, and Vietnam successfully obtained a communist government in the First Indochina War. The United States supplied France with large amounts of money because of the fear of the domino theory, the idea that communism will spread from Vietnam to all of its neighboring countries if it was not stopped at that point. However, the French were defeated by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu, which signaled the end of French colonial influence in Indochina. Afterwards, the United States became heavily involved in stopping communism in Vietnam and began to send soldiers over to fight. At the peak of Americans' involvement in the war, more than 500,000 United States military personnel were fighting in the Vietnam conflict. The countries involved in the war were the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. Cambodia was also involved in this war because they gave sanctuary to the Viet Cong soldiers. The outcome of the war was that the United States had to pull out because we could eventually not afford it. In January of 1973, representatives of the United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed a peace agreement in Paris, ending the direct United States military involvement in the Vietnam War. Its key provisions included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam, with the withdrawal of United States forces, the release of prisoners of war, and the reunification of North and South Vietnam through peaceful means. The South Vietnamese government was to remain in place until new elections were held, and the North Vietnamese forces in the South were not to advance further nor be reinforced. The short-term effects of the war was that the United States eventually lost most of its respects from its foreign allies. The long-term effects of the Vietnam War, however, were that the United States suffered under a worsened economy. Many United States citizens decided not to trust the government anymore because of the lies they were told during the war. The United States altered many policies, and United States leaders suffered under the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome affected many following U.S. leaders because they were afraid to send soldiers over to fight. The United States leaders only sent over soldiers when it was extremely necessary in order to protect their citizens' lives, or it was a war in which all citizens agreed on, and it was a simple win. Yeah, that's it. And that was all for the Vietnam War, and now we have Mark talking about the pop culture of the 1970s.
Thank you, Julia. And now for pop culture. My name is Mark, and I'll be covering the most popular parts of pop culture during the last 10 years. First, the most popular 70s movies was Alien. It was released on May 25th of 1979 and was considered to be a great sci-fi horror movie. The budget was $9 million, and it earned itself a domestic box office of $80 million and a worldwide box office of $203 million. It was depicted horror in a new way that earned itself a success, and I hope that a new sequel will come soon. The second most popular movie is Star Wars Episode 4. It was released on May 25th of 1977. It was also another great sci-fi movie, depicted action and adventure. The budget was $13 million. The domestic box office was $460 million, and its worldwide box office was $786 million. Another movie was Grease. It was a musical about romance in high school. It was released in June 16 of 1978. The budget was $6 million. The domestic box office was $181 million, and its worldwide box office was $387 million. It became a very popular musical, and I would recommend it to anyone watching our show. Next is the most popular 70s hairstyles and fashions. So the most popular fashion was the bell bottom and the platform disco shoes, and the hair was the shag. It was popularized by Jane Fonda in the 1971 film Clute. The nation followed her steps with this popular fashion. And then the next popular music was Staying Alive by the Bee Gees, and it was released in 1977. It earned itself a Grammy nomination for Best Song of the Year, but it did earn a Grammy in this category for Best Vocal Arrangement of 2 or more voices. And then the next popular pop culture was in books, and one of the books was The Shining by Stephen King. It was released in 1977, and it earned itself 350 million copies. It's considered to be a great horror book that I would also recommend to the viewers who are watching this. And now to Anne-Marie for societal issues.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Anne-Marie Mattel, and now on to the societal news of the 1970s. What a decade, am I right? As the 1970s continued, some of these people helped shape a new political movement known as the New Right. This movement, rooted in the urban Sun Belt, celebrated the free market and lamented the decline of traditional social values and roles. New right conservatives resented and resisted what they saw as government meddling. For example, they fought against high taxes, environmental regulations, highway speed limits, national park policies in the West, the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion, and affirmative action and school desegregation plans. The crusade to protect the environment from all sorts of assaults, toxic industrial waste in places like Love Canal, New York, dangerous meltdowns at nuclear power plants, such as the one at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, highways through city neighborhoods really took off during the 1970s. Americans celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970, and Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act that same year. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act followed 2 years later. The oil crisis of the late 1970s drew further attention to the issue of conservation. By then, environmentalism was so mainstream that the U.S. Forest Service's Woodsy Owl interrupted Saturday morning cartoons to remind kids to give a hoot and don't pollute. In 1972, after years of campaigning by feminists, Congress approved the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, to the Constitution, which reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex." It seemed that the amendment would pass easily. 22 of the necessary 38 states ratified it right away, and the remaining states seemed close behind. However, the ERA alarmed many conservative activists who feared that it would undermine traditional gender roles. These activists mobilized against the amendment and managed to defeat it. In 1977, Indiana became the 35th and last state to ratify the ERA. And now here's Antonio talking about the economy.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Now looking back at the past 10 years on our economical issues. So first, to start off, the Vietnam War worsened the United States economy. Inflation increased while jobs simultaneously decreased. The economy transitioned from a favorable balance of low inflation, full employment, and trade in the years from 1962 to 1965 to a double-digit percentage of inflation. The increased inflation was due to Lyndon B. Johnson's idea to concurrently finance his Great Society program in the Vietnam War effort without any significant increase in taxes. Johnson eventually increased taxes by 10% in 1969, but ultimately it was too late and the tax charge was too minuscule to help fix the United States economy at the time. The United States of America could not afford to support the war if they intended to keep the Great Society programs afloat. So many people supported the idea of abandoning the war effort. If Johnson left Vietnam as soon as his presidency began, he would not have forced the economy to drop significantly. He spent about $300 billion to $900 billion on the Vietnam War. This money was used on weapons and soldiers and also included veteran benefits and interests, which left a heavy burden on the United States economy. Inflation fueled by the escalation of Vietnam, and later Yom Kippur War, also increased food prices and contributed to the oil price hike in 1973, which led then to the inflationary expected. I'm your host, Antonio Liberato, and good night.